Greetings, everyone. In this video, we're going to take a look at .NET Fundamentals configuration. We'll also go through a hands-on lab exercise. So let's get started. What are we going to be covering today? I want to tell you a little bit about what configuration is and why it's important. We'll talk about .NET's configuration specifically, and as well as with that, the default configuration that you're given with .NET Core. Next, we'll talk about the various providers and what's available to you. And then we'll cover the next steps, as well as a hands-on lab and demo. So let's go ahead and get started. Configuration is super important. What we don't want to do is we don't want to hard code values first and foremost. And in some situations, we want to change values per environment, right? You may want to connect to a certain database in dev versus production, right? Or even a different web service, or maybe even have a different setting for something or other. So that's the whole reason why we have these configuration files, is so we don't have to hard code them, don't have to recompile the application every time. And really, the goal is to allow us to do this kind of build once and deploy many, and literally just change our configuration files per environment and to be able to improve our CI/CD process. With .NET configuration, first thing is to really keep up on the fundamentals of the documentation. And that's really where a lot of the stuff that we'll be looking at. So if you go out to Microsoft's documentation page right here under fundamentals and then configuration, most of what we're going to be talking about today is directly taken from here. So feel free to use this as a reference, but this is where most of the content that we're getting from is. So with that, when you start up a .NET project, Program CS executes, and there's a create default builder method that gets executed. And with that, that loads the default configuration. However, you can easily override that. It's up to you on what you want to set up in there. Because most of the configuration files have a hierarchical structure, whether that's JSON, XML, or whatever, to access that hierarchy or different namespaces, you'll use a semicolon as a separator for the most common practice. And there's a variety of configuration providers, and if there's not one that suits you, you can even make your own. So the flexibility is tremendously powerful. As I just mentioned, the default configuration is set up when you execute the create default builder in the program CS. And when you execute that, the following options are configuration options are loaded in this order. First is the ChainedConfigurationProvider, and that also is going to register the IConfiguration to the dependency injection container. The next thing is if you have an appsettings.json, it will load that as a base configuration. Now, all these others will be stacked on top of it. So if you have a appsettings.environment.json, and this specifically means if you have development, staging, production, and you've actually configured the environment as such, it will try to use that configuration file and stack it on top of the appsettings.json. If you don't have the environment variable set, it will assume that the environment is production, and it will try to find a appsettings.production.json file. If you don't have that file, it will not be loaded. Simple as that. When you're developing locally, if you have your environment set to development, you can actually use your app settings app secrets or user secrets file, which is great to go ahead and override any of those app settings. Specifically in cases where you don't want to check in your username, password, or connection string into source control, which is bad practice, you would go ahead and override that with the local user settings in that case if you needed that functionality. Next, the next two, I've almost never used the next two options of environment variables, and we're talking about the Windows system environment variables is what we're referring to there. In command line arguments, that is helpful in some cases. If you're running a console application, that might be something you want to consider. But I've very rarely, used those two options. Next is providers. So natively out of the box, you saw the appsettings.json is a JSON configuration file, right? But you can actually, instead of having that specific name, you can load additional configuration files by JSON or even XML or even old school INI. Now, I personally haven't used XML and INI and .NET Core. I just, pretty much all the configuration now is just JSON. It makes sense. But there are those options if you have those kinds of configuration files you want to load. And they can be loaded dynamically, by the way. So a lot of these will have options to refresh on change or just load during the initial, launching of the application. So there's various options you'll have there. I mentioned user secrets and it being able to, while you're local debugging and developing, you can override, and that's a great option. So keep that in mind. I personally haven't used the dictionary objects in memory there, but that is an option. It's outlined in the Microsoft documentation. So if you want to use that, take a look at there. We already mentioned environment variables and command line, but the next two are very cool: app configuration and Azure Key Vault. Now, app configuration is a centralized, Azure cloud-based configuration service. It's great. It also includes feature management and feature flags. So definitely something to check out. Not only that, but even if you didn't want to use Key Vault directly, you can actually use Azure App Configuration and have it piggyback to Azure Key Vault. So I personally would rather start with app config and then Azure Key Vault behind it if we needed to. And then last but not least, if you do have other requirements, you can create your own configuration provider yourself. So that's very, very possible. So I think it's very important just to understand that, we want to use configuration files. You don't want to hard code values, and you don't want to have administrators changing values, per environment. We also, it makes it very simple if you decide to go ahead and use configuration files per environment, a distinct one. And what I mean by that is, I've had some people who, that's why, again, I say don't use, appsetting.json, is because people will try to stack those in various ways. And sometimes they'll put stuff, that's common amongst all files in the app settings and then just different ones in the environment, or have the environment just use slightly different settings on a few things. I don't recommend that stacking because it makes it very difficult to troubleshoot in a lot of situations. And we mentioned before about the user secrets, app secrets. Don't store usernames and passwords in source control or stuff that gets checked into source control. And that's where the user secrets come in very handy to be able to avoid that kind of stuff, as well as using Azure App Config or Azure Key Vault. Those are great options as well. So here's a link to the source code we're going to be going through here in a moment. github.com/bradthecoder/samples.configuration. Go ahead and download that, clone that repository, and go ahead and launch the solution, and we'll take a look at that. Now that we've cloned the repository, let's go ahead and open up the solution and take a look at what we have to work with today. So essentially, this is a file new ASP.NET project that's MVC. And accepting most all the defaults. So let's go through all the changes that I've made here for our demo and then set up for our lab exercise. So the first thing you'll notice is I've added a staging and production configuration files. And also in the development, you'll see we have this section here, sample app, settings, background color, and message. And the color and message are slightly different for staging and for production. Okay. Close those. Next thing we're going to look at is our controllers. So we have one sample controller we're going to look at first, and it's going to support two different views. One view, we're simply going to return the view, and we're going to be doing dependency injection in the view. And then secondly, we have dependency injection going on here in this particular controller, and we're leveraging it to get out the list of providers. If you remember to our lecture, the list of providers that's registered is fairly important, so you know which particular configuration is being used from which provider. And we'll see that in the view. Supporting those are views here. So read all, and I don't really recommend doing a view injection, but sometimes you do need to do it. There's absolutely reasons to have this. So in this case, we're just doing a dependency injection, and then we're just looping through all of the name value pairs there to read out all of the configuration that has been loaded. On the providers, we're passing in a simple model that just has a collection of strings, right? And then we're just going to output that. So that's going to have our list of providers in their order. And we'll go ahead and take a look while we're here in the code. Our lab exercise is just a placeholder controller set up with dependency injection, and we're going to do almost the same, similar types of things. We're going to access configuration from a view, and then we're going to hydrate a simple model here and pass that to the view. And they're supporting views very similar. We're just going to take in either that model or the dependency injection, set a background color, and then set the particular message there, display it. And both of them are very, very similar. And there's the model we're passing in for this one. So before we get to the lab exercises, let's go ahead and take a look at what we have as far as the samples there that are included. Now here, I've just slightly customized this home page. We've got a link to the documentation, so if you want to use that for reference, that's what that's for. And then a link to our debug pages that we just looked at, the providers page and the read all configuration page. So providers page, if you remember, it's going to load in that list of providers just like we said, based on the create default builder. First, it's going to load in that chained provider. Then it's going to optionally load in app settings. And then appsettings.development, because we are set up as development environment, and then the environment variables and command line. We look at the read all configuration, it's actually going to dump out everything because we have, remember, we have the environment variable set, so it's going to pull in everything from Windows as well. I'm using a Windows machine, so these are actually Windows variables. You see most of these. Here's our customized ones that we have, that we've set. And one of my favorite, just to clarify, this is Windows is your path statement. Obviously, that's a huge Windows thing. But you can see here, this is quite a bit of information that you have available to you in configuration. So these little samples are great just to help you debug if you're not sure what configuration is set to. So now let's take a look at the lab exercises. So instead of having you watch me click around and type the lab exercises, they are available in a completed form added on a feature branch in the GitHub repo. So let's kind of just take a look at what those entail. So looking at our controller, if we look at that controller there, we're doing dependency injection, and then we're simply hydrating those two particular properties. I don't recommend putting the your path here as string here right in your code. I'd recommend using a resource file or something to that effect, but this is just an example to get the point that we're pulling those in, hydrating those two properties on this very simple model, right? And then we're going to pass that to the view. So let's look at that one first, and then we'll look at the access and dependency injection in the view there for configuration. All right, so now let's take a look at our results here. If we look at the controller, we're simply passing in that view, so we're able to use our property there for the background color as well as the message. Slightly different for the view, we're doing dependency injection right there. And then we're setting up a couple of variables that we can then later on work with, very similar to what we did on the model. And then we're passing these variables here and specifying them. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So now if we go to our lab exercises, we see our message development and we have our white background. Same type of thing for view. Okay. Now, interestingly, as you recall, we have a slightly different configuration for production and staging. And to play around with that, we'll have a whole entire lab exercise on environments. But if you want to take a look at that, it's set, your environment variable set here, and we're at development. But let's say we wanted to see what staging would look like. Okay. Let's launch that. And if we go to our views, we have yellow and staging for both of these. And then also it's interesting, if you go over and look at providers, it knows to load the staging configuration provider. All right. And lastly, let's go ahead and just change this to production really quickly. And if we look at our controller, we have the kind of a reddish pink and reddish pink again. And then also on our providers, it knows to load the production configuration. All right, that's great. I would encourage you to go ahead and go through those lab exercises yourself and play around with that. And feel free to, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and sign up for notifications, and I'll see you in the next video. Here's some other videos you might like.